Hey Peeps, welcome to another video. Today it is part 4 of the 6560 sew along. Today we're going to be adding the flounce, finishing off the front neckline, adding the sleeves and hemming our blouse. So let's get started. The next thing that the pattern would like us to do is step number 6, and it's on outside pin flounce to neck edge of blouse, matching centre backs, shoulder seams and large dots, and baste that into place. So I'm going to grab my flounce, match up all of the points that it would like us to match and get that sewn into place. I am going to baste this, but I am going to do that with bias binding because I'm making a sheer shirt, so I haven't cut a facing because I didn't want there to be a bulky facing showing through the sheerness. So I'm going to finish this neck edge with bias binding. So I'm going to get that done next and I'll pin it in place and show you what it's going to look like as I go. Okay, so I've pinned my flounce onto my shirt, and I've pinned it with the wrong side of the flounce to the right side of the shirt, and I've pinned it matching up the side seams. There's notches at the back and then all the way down to the front. Now I'm going to sew this on with 3/8 of an inch seam allowance because I have a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance to play with here, and my bias binding that I'm going to use to finish this edge has a 1/4 of an inch piece before it's fold, so I want a nice clear line of where I can match up the raw edge of my binding and make sure that I'm sewing at 5/8 of an inch. So if I sew this on at 3/8 of an inch, that will give me that guideline to attach my binding to. So I'm going to sew this on. I'm then going to need to attach the ties that I made earlier, and then I'll be able to put on my binding. I have secured my flounce and I'm now going to baste on the ties that I made earlier. So I have the folded edge of the tie going towards the bottom of the shirt, and again, because I'm adding this part in, I'm looking at the picture here and the tie does go to just underneath the flounce, so that's where I've chosen to pin it onto my shirt. So I'm going to baste this into place and then I can add my bias binding to finish my neckline. I have sewn my bias binding onto the wrong side, the interior of my garment, and I actually have sewn it with the edges flush because I realised when I got this bias binding out that this is one of the less uniform, as you can see, bias bindings that I've bought, and it is quite wide, so when I turn it back on itself to encase this raw edge, it actually ends up being quite wide. And it ends up being the width that I would like it to be for me to then turn it back on itself to turn it under to finish the hem. I, as I say, have sewn it right up to the edge. Now, depending on the type of bias binding you use, you'll want to work out whether that's a viable option for you or not. If it's not, then as I say, you can use, if you have got, if your binding is a 1/4 of an inch there and uniform in size, then you can use this line of stitching that we attached our frill with as a guide to attach the edge of your bias binding. I'm now going to use my blind hem foot because it has a guide in it here. I've got my needle moved all the way over to the right, and I'm going to use that to run up against the edge of my bias binding so that I can sew a nice clean finish on the edge of my bias binding before I then turn it to the inside to finish off that seam. Okay, so I'm sewing on the binding using my blind hem foot. I don't pin this down. I use my finger on my right hand to push the fabric flat, and then I use the finger of my left hand to push the binding down, and then use the guide on my foot against the edge of the binding to sew a nice straight line. Now there's some curves that you've got to go around, and there's a lot of fullness here with the flounce, so you want to make sure that everything's lying nice and flatly as you go. It takes a little bit of time, and it takes a little bit of time to kind of perfect this, especially when you get to tighter curves like we are going to be getting to at the neckline here, but it's a really nice finish, and I like the way that this foot allows me to have a nice straight line of stitching along my bias binding. So I'm going to get this done, and it's a little bit difficult to go through the viewfinder, but I'll get there. You just want to make sure that you are manoeuvring everything around, that you're not sewing through anything that you shouldn't be sewing through. As I say, just take your time and rearrange as necessary. So once I'd sewn the facing down, I haven't pressed this yet, I turned it round and I was finding that the binding was peeking out just a little bit. So I've gone back through and I have sewn another line of stitching just to secure the ruffle to the binding so that it doesn't there isn't a lip of it kind of peeking through from the front of the shirt. So the next thing I need to do is move on to the sleeves. So the first thing it'd like us to do is ease stitch top edge of sleeve between notches and stitch underarm seam. Press 5/8 of an inch on lower edge of sleeve to inside forming casing. Press under 1/4 of an inch on raw edge. Stitch close to inner edge of casing, leaving an opening to insert elastic. So that's every single sleeve instruction in one paragraph. So the first thing that we're going to do is add in some ease stitching or gathering stitching to the top of the sleeve head, and I'm going to do that in the same manner that I do all of my gathering stitching. So I'm going to sew 3/8 of an inch away from the raw edge with a super long stitch 4.5 on my machine, and then 3/8 of an inch away from that previous line of gathering stitches, and that just helps me get the gathers to sit nicely into the sleeve head. I am then going to French seam the sleeve seam, because of course I am. I have my gathering stitches in the sleeve cap, and I have now pinned the sleeve seam together, right sides together. I'm going to sew this at 1/4 of an inch. I have sewn my first stitching line. I have trimmed my seam allowance in half. I'm now going to go and press this with the right sides together so that I can sew the final seam at 3/8 of an inch. And we're going to want to press this seam towards the front of our sleeve because we've pressed the bodice seams towards the back of our bodice so that we can nest these seams at the underarm. I've finished my seam off by sewing it together, right sides together at 3/8 of an inch. So I have a French seam and I have pressed it towards the front of the sleeve. So I'm now going to finish off the hems whilst the sleeves are two separate pieces of fabric, just a little bit easier than doing it once they're on the shirt. So the pattern wants you to fold up the bottom edge by 5/8 of an inch and press, and then fold that under by 1/4 of an inch and press, and stitch that in place. I find that really difficult to do. I find it difficult to do evenly. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to sew around the bottom at 1/4 of an inch and use that as my pressing guide to then press up again to then stitch it in place. I find that usually a little bit easier, especially with this fabric, which is quite slippery. Whilst I'm hemming the sleeves, I've also started to hem the bottom of my shirt. So I've done the same thing. I've run a line of stitching 3/8 of an inch away from the bottom edge, which I'm going to use as my pressing guide so that I can turn it up and turn it up again evenly and stitch it down. So I have sewn the hem of the sleeve and I have left a small opening to put the elastic into. The elastic guide that comes with the pattern is 8.5 inches for my size, so I'm going to measure out 2 pieces of 1/4 inch elastic at 8.5 inches, which I'm going to feed through this channel and make sure that I don't get it twisted before I close it up. So once you've thread your elastic through the channel that you've made, you need to overlap it by about 1/2 inch and stitch it down, which I've done here. Obviously not very neatly, but that's never going to get seen. So you then want to feed this into the channel, and then we're going to close up the little gap that we left to feed the elastic in. We're going to close that with some stitching, and that's the hem of our sleeves finished. Now that the sleeves are finished, we need to attach them to the shirt. So I'm doing that with a French seam. I have got the underarm matched. I have nested the seams. We have pressed the sleeve seam towards the front and the spot blouse seam towards the back, so you can nest those seams together at the underarm. I've matched up the single notch at the front, the double notch at the back, and then the notch at the top of the sleeve to the shoulder, and then I've just eased in the rest of the fullness around the sleeve, and I've done that wrong sides together. So I'm now going to sew at 1/4 of an inch the whole way around I can then trim that, press it, and sew the final seam at 3/8 of an inch, and that will be our sleeves French seamed in, and I will show you each step as we go. I've sewn my sleeves in and I have trimmed the seam allowance down in half, as you can see here. So I'm now going to go and press this with the right sides together so that I can finish up the sleeve hem, and then we're nearly done. I've pressed my seam back on itself so the right sides are together, and I'm now going to sew at 3/8 of an inch the entire way around the armhole to finish off that seam. Then I'm going to need to remove these gathering stitches that we put in earlier, and that'll be our sleeves done. The last thing we need to do is put in a buttonhole so that the ties can go through on the, as you're wearing it, right hand side. So I have laid my blouse out flat and I have marked where the tie hits on the side seam here, and I'm actually going to sew my buttonhole through the French seam on this side. Now I have a lightweight fabric, so I'm going to use some of my interfacing, and I'm not going to stick it down. I'm going to put some underneath and some on top, which will help stabilize the buttonhole as I go. And I like to practice before I start doing anything like this, so I've done some practice buttonholes here and they are the right size and they're working out really well, so I'm going to get that done next. Okay, so my buttonhole is in. I'm going to gently tear away this interfacing, and I had some on the underside as well, so I'm going to take that off. Now I'm going to use some fray check on the buttonhole before I open it up, and then we are finished. As ever, if you have any questions at all, please let me know in the comment section down below and I will do my best to answer them for you. As I mentioned in part 1, this pattern was chosen by my Patreon peeps, and they then voted on the fabric that I was going to use. This is a sheer fabric that I got from the knitting and stitching show from the textile centre. It was one of the ones that they had an offcut of it. I think it was 2.3 meters. I think I have around about a meter left, which I'm very excited about because I think I'm going to make a camisole out of it. I really like this shirt. I mean, as you know, I love this kind of sleeve. I've really gone into this kind of sleeve recently. I really like the flounce. This blouse is sheer. I think you can see my bra there. I would usually wear a black bra under this, but I don't have that with me at the moment. As I say, I'm on holiday, so I've got a red one on underneath it, but I don't think this blouse is so sheer that that's a problem. Definitely will be making this again. It has many options. It has shorter sleeves, it has grown on sleeves with like trim finishes there. You can do it without the flounce. I really like the flounce. I mean, you know that I like flouncy things, and I have made this have an integral wrap rather than a separate tie belt, because the pattern would like you to do a buttonhole and a button closure on one side and then ribbon closure on the other side, and that's just not something that I like to wear. So I have made it an integral wrap shirt, so the ties are included into the front part of the bodice, which is much more kind of the thing that I prefer. So I've done that. I'm definitely going to make this blouse again. When I went through to trace this pattern off, I traced every single version that they had because I knew that I liked all of the versions, and I can imagine myself making all of them. It is quite snug at the armhole, not uncomfortably so. I can definitely wear this, but it is something that I am aware of, so there is that to bear in mind. But other than that, I don't think there is anything that I don't like about this. I think I made a straight size 12, and where it hits is just above where my hips start to flare out. So whilst it said that I needed a size 18 for my hips, I have gotten away with the size 12, which is great. This is definitely not a blouse to be worn tucked into things. I think it would, the minute you did this, I think it would pull out of anything you had it tucked into. And as I say, because I've added the ties as an integral part of the blouse rather than an extra tie to go over the top, I don't think it would work tucked into things because of those as well. So that's also something to bear in mind. So as I mentioned, my Patreon peeps have picked both the pattern and fabric, and you'll see a whole bunch of names running along the bottom of the screen here, and it's thank you to every single one of you for taking the time to vote on which pattern I should do and then vote on which fabric I should do, and for taking the time and money to support me and my channel. It is very much appreciated, so thank you very much. As ever, if any of you guys decide to follow along with my tutorial, please use the hashtag Sian made me do it when you post your makes on Instagram or Facebook, because I love seeing what you guys make. So I really hope you've enjoyed today's video. If you have, please give it a thumbs up. If you haven't yet, please subscribe, and I'll see you again very soon. Bye!